This video is brought to you by Ground News. Even if we should ever be forced to yield, for everything that grows great also decays, the memory of our greatness will be bequeathed to posterity forever. That we, of all the Greeks, ruled over more Greeks than anyone. That in the greatest wars we held out against enemies, in alliance and individually. And that we lived in a city that was the most ingenious and the greatest. Hello noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and today I come to you with a question. What is the difference between ancient Athenian democracy and modern democracies, for example, American democracy? What is the level of correlation between these forms of government that, in spite of being thousands of years apart, still share the same name? So, how similar are they? We shall attempt to answer this question through a full examination of the available data, through the lenses of historical precision, linguistic scrutiny, and political theory. If we were to bring an ancient Athenian back to life and we explain to him the fundamentals of American democracy, would he even recognize it as a democracy at all? A democracy is a form of government among many other forms of early political systems. Now, to fully appreciate what the ancient Athenians meant when they created the word democracy, a few words should be spent onto the etymology of the word itself. This word in modern Greek is pronounced demokratia. Now, in restored classical Attic pronunciation, which would be the target pronunciation for this video as it would have been in use between the 5th and 4th century respectively, this would have been pronounced demokratia. The word is the combination of two distinct words, demos, which means people, and kratos, which can be translated as power, might, strength, power to the people, rule of the people. Note that this is a pitch-based type of pronunciation. If you want to learn more and deep dive into these sort of linguistic topics, then I would refer you to my second channel, Metronauts Academy. Even though we often hear that democracy was created and invented in Greece in the year 500 BC, evidence seems to suggest that a proto-democratic government, in more of a broad sense, existed in several areas of the world well before the 5th century BC. It is therefore plausible to assume that democracy in one form or another arises naturally within any cohesive group of people, such for example a tribe, if these two factors are present. The group is sufficiently independent of control by outsiders. A substantial number of members, such as tribal leaders or elders, consider themselves equally qualified to participate in decision-making about matters of concern to the group as a whole. It is very probable that democratic systems existed among several, if not many, tribal hunter-gatherer populations for thousands of years prior to the establishment of classical Greek democracy. Still, throughout this video, for clarity's sake, we'll refer to this early type of democracy as primitive democracy. But if that's so, then why were hierarchical and authoritarian forms of social organization so common in the ancient world, such as monarchies, despotism, aristocracy, oligarchy, and so on? As the lengthy period of hunting and gathering came to an end and humans began to settle, switching their primary source of subsistence from hunting to agriculture and trade, the conditions that favor popular participation in government appear to have become rare. Greater social distance in wealth and military power between communities, together with a marked increase in population sizes, encouraged absolute forms of government. As a result, popular governments among settled people vanished, to be replaced by kings. Finally, around 500 BC, conditions we would deem favorable for democracies reappeared. This is considered to be the birth of classical or Greek democracy, which is a form of direct democracy. We'll get back to that. Greek democracy was a far more complex and advanced form when compared to primitive democracies. The most crucial developments occurred in two areas of the Mediterranean, Greece and Rome. Now, what I'm about to say might sound confusing and strange to modern audiences, but even the Roman Republic was a form of democracy. We'll clear that one out later on the video. And now I'd like to take a moment to mention the sponsor that made this video possible, Ground News. Ground News is a website and app that shows you how breaking news is being covered across the political spectrum. compare headlines across the political spectrum using media bias ratings driven by data. And it is also the biggest source for breaking news around the world. Now, you know how much I fight bias and politically charged and one-sided information on this platform, so it was only natural that I would really enjoy Ground News. Ground News says that they're on a mission to well-inform the world by making it easy for readers to think freely about the issues of our time. They say, we believe in a future of positive coexistence where civil debate is the norm, media is accountable, and critical thought is the baseline of our information consumption. Where have you been all my life? I've personally benefited from using Ground News because it really helps me figure out whether, for instance, a news has been exaggerated by the media, and it also helps me through clickbait to find out what's actually going on. It stands firmly against misinformation, media bias, and political polarization. And it also helps bringing forth the financial motivations of media companies. It's also very easy to use Ground News because you can literally just swipe between headlines to see how the same story has been framed by center, left, and right sources. They also have global coverage to watch how international stories are being covered across the globe. For me, this is actually quite cool as an Italian who lives in America, because whenever I hear about like a news or something that's been broadcast in Italy by my friends who are still living in Italy, then I can always immediately go double check it and see what they're on about. You can customize your feed, choose from over 150,000 topics, locations, and people to follow. So what are you waiting for? Now is the time. Click the link in the description below and start using Ground News for free, or become a member and start supporting a small group of creators that are trying to make the media and the news more transparent. And big thanks to Ground News for sponsoring my channel. To understand how democracy came about in ancient Greece, we first need to set the stage by including all of the external factors that played pivotal roles in its emergence. The geographical position, foreign threat, and the socioeconomic strata. Greece wasn't a single country in the way we understand it today. It didn't have a single state and a single government. Instead, it was a collection of cities that were their own states, namely city-states. When it comes to the formation of these city-states, the way we understand it is that they probably began as families, then clans, then tribes, joining together for both protection and in order to thrive. The reason why we mostly talk about Athenian democracy, if anything, when it comes to ancient Greece, is because Athens was not only the most famous city-state, but it is also the best documented one, although I say this in a comparative key, in the sense that since surviving evidence of democratic theory is scant at best, we unfortunately don't have a very detailed account. With that being said, we still have sufficient data we can work with. So in 507 BC, the Athenians decided to adopt a form of popular government which will not only work, but it will last for nearly 2 centuries. But how did it work? And why did it eventually fall? The invention of democracy didn't happen by chance. It was a precise response to specific geopolitical pressures, forces that molded it into its shape. If the world was fire, ancient Athenians were the skilled smiths that could use it to create power. Greece was surrounded by powerful civilizations, the Egyptians to the south, Persia to the east, Macedonia to the north, and the Phoenicians to the west and east. Not being able to have proper interactions with foreign powers could have meant subjugation, or even worse, annihilation. And this was even before Rome entered the stage. As Ryan Chapman beautifully put it on his marvel of a dedicated video, ancient Greece was positioned to be a sort of focal point among the flourishing civilizations of the time. It is against this backdrop that the Athenian democratic system was born. Democracy is based on one solid core concept, acting as a sort of theoretical nucleus, so to speak, from which all the rest of the system stems from, with its citizen having direct control over political and legal matters, enjoying equal standing in public life. We could therefore say that democracy is a response mechanism fueled by the rejection of the rule by a small elite. Athenian democracy was fleshed out in the masses against the few, and it stood in complete opposition to monarchy, the theory being based on 4 fundamental concepts. Isonomia, equality before the law; isegoria, equality of speech; parrhesia, capacity to speak freely; eleutheria, freedom; Now, as modern people with a more than a significant disconnect from ancient Athenians, we're talking about 2,500 years, I want to say that these core concepts still resonate with us. Furthermore, American democracy was founded after the American people won the War of Independence against the English crown. So, in a way, it was also a response against monarchy. So, does that mean that Athenian democracy and American democracy are the same? No. American democracy only partially resembles Athenian democracy. Hence, even though on the surface both appear as an opposing position against monarchies, Athenian democracy was the result of a power struggle between classes, while American democracy begins as a strike of independence against a faraway monarch. Moreover, the difference doesn't necessarily lie in its core, but in its practical executions. So when we say that in a democracy, people hold power over the government, what do we mean exactly by the people? Which people? In Athenian democracy, in order to be allowed to take an active role in political discussion, join the council, join the assembly, you had to be an adult Athenian free male. And just for clarity's sake, an adult means over the age of 18 or over the age of 20 as we progress in time. This means that the following people were excluded from political life and voting: children, women, slaves, non-citizen. This means that of a population of over 60,000 people, only 10 to 20% would qualify, which also means that about 80 to 90% of the Athenian population had no right to political privileges. So, within context, demokratia means power to 20% of the people. Still a lot more and a big mass compared to power to a king, but just so we're clear. This is the first point of difference with modern democracies. Once again, using American democracy as a point of reference, children and non-citizen are still not allowed to vote either. But women can vote, and slaves don't exist anymore. So, compared to Athenian democracy, the number and the type of people that are allowed to vote in American democracy is much higher. With that being said, please keep in mind the following points. Universal suffrage, or the extension of the right to vote to women in America, is only relatively recent. Passed by Congress on the 4th of June 1919 and ratified on the 18th of August 1920. The 19th Amendment granted women the right to vote. The 19th Amendment being already introduced in Congress in 1878, but still very recent. When it comes to the abolition of slavery, the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution is the one that abolished slavery and involuntary servitude. Congress passed the 13th Amendment in 1865, being ratified by 27 out of the 36 states in December 1865. It was the first of the so-called Reconstruction Amendments following the American Civil War. Thus, if we actually look at the type of people that were excluded from political power and involvement during the early democracy in America, it's actually very similar to Athenian democracy, since both women and slaves didn't have any right to vote. And besides, being a slave in ancient Athens is not the same thing as being a slave in early democratic America. Again, same term, not the exact same meaning. For instance, in both Athenian and early American democracy, being a slave meant that you were owned by your owner. And as your owner's term of natural life came to an end, in American democracy, you would be inherited as a slave, you and your family. You would be passed down generation to generation, making it basically virtually impossible to reach freedom. In Athenian democracy, however, as the owner of a slave died, it wasn't uncommon for that slave to be freed. Also, under Athenian democracy, slaves enjoyed a certain level of legal protection in the sense that if a slave was mistreated and badly beaten by their owners, he or she could run away into a temple for protection and could denounce their owner, who would then be forced to sell the slave. In Athens, slaves were also allowed to participate in business as long as they would give their owner a share of their earnings. The Athenian government also employed a number of slaves, and many of them were given an allowance and were permitted to live where they pleased. The same cannot be said for slaves in early American democracy. This of course doesn't mean that being a slave in Athens was nice 2,500 years ago, but it is still quite impressive to see how mild the Athenians were to their slaves in a comparative key. Clearly there will be exceptions. Being one of these slaves in a silver mine? Absolutely not. With that being said, if I had to choose, I would rather be a slave in ancient Athens than in early democratic America. Okay, so democracy, power to the people, we have explained what people means in both Athenian democracy and American democracy. But what about the power section of this word? What do we mean by power, and how much power? Well, this is going to be another massive point of difference between Athenian democracy and American democracy. So we have just explained that in Athenian democracy a lot less people compared to American democracy had actually access to power. However, those 10 to 20% of the population who did have access to power had access to a lot of political power, in the sense that in Athenian democracy you had several capable politically charged bodies within the system. You had the assembly, you had the council, and you had the jury. Let's begin with the assembly. 10 times a year, the citizen of Athens with access to political privilege would meet on a hill called the Pnyx, which was near the Acropolis, to form the so-called assembly. During this assembly, all sorts of policies would be discussed, and every member of the assembly would have the ability to express their opinions. Once thoroughly discussed, there would be a voting with the raising of hand. Simple majority, policy passed. These policies would be prepared by the Council of 500, which was the most powerful body, as they would be the ones who would decide which policies would be discussed in the first place. But Athenians did not have permanent public figures, which means that the members of this Council of 500 would be elected by lot and constantly renewed. Last but not least, when it comes to legal matters, the Athenians did not have professional lawyers, nor were there judges. The only body that could pass on judgments and settle political cases was the jury of 500, big enough to not be bribable. In other words, from our point of view, it was a sort of amateur approach to law. Also, keep in mind that the assembly was so powerful that they could vote out generals if they weren't performing well. In fact, the only exception to this rule, apart from the generals, were naval architects and superintendents of the water supplies. All other public officials were chosen randomly. All public officials had their power tightly controlled by the assembly. Now let's compare that with American democracy. You see, even though a moment ago we discussed the fact that in American democracy a lot more people and a lot more types of people have access to political privilege, the amount of actual power that people have in American democracy compared to Athenian democracy is a lot smaller. That is because American democracy is not a form of direct democracy, it's a form of representative democracy, aka federal constitutional representative democracy. In the sense that American citizens under the American democracy have the power to choose, vote, and select their representative officials, but then it's the officials that make the decisions, not the people, when it comes to policies, when it comes to relationship against foreign powers, when it comes to whether you're going to war or not. Look at it this way. The American people do not have the power to dismiss a general, and you do not have neither power nor control over FBI, CIA, and so forth. So, do you remember when I said that the Roman Republic was a form of democracy? Well, here's the kicker. American democracy, it being a representative democracy, is actually much closer to the Roman Republic than it is to Athenian democracy. That is because the Roman Republic was a form of representative democracy, because the people could choose their senators and their officials, and then it was the officials that would discuss and pass the policies and decide their relationships with foreign powers. So even though from a modern perspective sometimes we look at words such as republic and democracy as two separate and distinct types of governments, in reality both have a certain level of overlap. And this is evident even in the early times of American democracy, where words republic and democracy were used as synonyms, including by the founding fathers. This doesn't necessarily mean that a republic is the exact same thing as a democracy. A republic is a type of democracy, but the two words absolutely have a certain level of overlap. So, is America a republic or a democracy? Yes. But I believe that this sort of sums up quite nicely and neatly the differences between all of these different types of democracy. If you found this video interesting, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more content from the Metatron, and also don't forget to check the link in the description below to take advantage of the great offer by Ground News. Thank you very much for watching, noble ones, and remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye.